The voicemail was 43 seconds long. I know because I played it 4 times in the parking garage beneath the convention center, sitting in my car in full regalia, blue hood, gold cords, the whole academic costume, while my phone screen fogged from my breath in the November cold. My mother's voice was cheerful. Not apologetic. Cheerful. "Hi, sweetheart. We're just sitting down to eat. Your aunt drove all the way from Phoenix, and you know how she gets if we push the reservation. We'll watch the recording later tonight, I promise. Your father says congratulations. Love you." That was it. No background noise of a freeway, no shuffle of someone running late. Just restaurant ambiance, silverware, and a woman who had confused a live stream link with showing up. I was 40 minutes from receiving my doctoral hood in nutritional biochemistry. 8 years of work. 2 publications. 1 fellowship that paid my rent for 3 years while I mapped metabolic disease pathways in low-income rural counties. My mother was at Carmine Steakhouse celebrating my younger sister's promotion to district sales manager at a pharmaceutical company. I found that out from the family group text, where my aunt had posted a photo of the dessert menu with 3 fire emojis. The academic procession was about to begin. I got out of the car. "Let me ask you something before I go further. Have you ever arrived somewhere important and realized mid-arrival that you had been the only one who understood it was important?" That specific flavor of alone, I had been marinating in it for years before that parking garage. It just took a voicemail to finally taste it clearly. I grew up in a house where achievement operated on a sliding scale calibrated entirely to my sister Dana. Dana was magnetic the way some people simply are, loud laugh, easy confidence, the kind of person who walks into a room and makes it reorganize itself around her. Our parents did not consciously prefer her. I believe that now. But unconscious preference has consequences that feel identical to the conscious kind. Dana's B+ was a triumph. My A- was, "You seem tired lately, Margot. Everything okay?" Dana's entry-level job offer was a dinner at Carmine's. My full academic scholarship was, "You'll want to eat something before your shift at the tutoring center." By the time I was standing in the procession line at the University of Colorado, adjusting my hood while strangers' parents took photos around me, I had accumulated a decade of those small recalibrations. The ones where you quietly lower your own expectations, so the gap between what you hoped for and what arrived doesn't split you open. A woman beside me in line, older, second career, radiating the particular warmth of someone who had fought hard to be there, noticed me standing without anyone fussing over my collar or straightening my regalia. "Is your family inside already?" she asked. "They couldn't make it," I said. She touched my arm once, briefly. "Then we'll cheer extra loud for each other." Her name was called before mine. I cheered loudly. When they called mine, Margot Voss, Doctor of Philosophy in Nutritional Biochemistry and Public Health Systems, she cheered back from across the auditorium, and I walked across that stage to the sound of a stranger keeping her word. The reception afterward was in a glass atrium overlooking the foothills. I stood at a high-top table with a glass of mediocre white wine and watched families cluster, and I thought, I have spent 31 years trying to earn a front-row seat in my own life. I took out my phone and opened the group text. Dana's promotion photos were still at the top. Below them, my earlier message, "Ceremony starts at 2. Section D, rows 12 through 20, no response. Not even a thumbs up from my father. I scrolled past all of it and opened my email. There was a message from Dr. Philippa Crane at the Meridian Institute for Food Systems Research in Portland. She had been recruiting me for 8 months. The position was lead researcher on a federally funded study examining supply chain contamination vulnerabilities in large-scale food distribution networks, essentially using data modeling to find the places where the food system was most likely to make people sick before it happened. It was professionally the exact thing my dissertation had been building toward. I had been hesitating because Portland meant leaving Denver, leaving the city where my parents lived, leaving the ambient possibility that someday the situation with my family would quietly improve. I replied to Dr. Crane that evening from my apartment, still in my graduation dress, eating leftover soup. I accepted the position. I told her I could start in 6 weeks. Then I did something I had been drafting in the back of my mind for 2 years. I legally changed my last name. Not to hurt anyone. Not as a declaration of war. I changed it to my maternal grandmother's maiden name, Aldrin, because she had been the one person in my family. She had died when I was 19 and left me her library and a handwritten note that said, "You are going to be extraordinary. Don't let anyone talk you into being less." Margot Aldrin felt like honoring something real. Margot Voss had started to feel like a role I'd been miscast in. I told my parents in a brief email. Clinical, warm enough to be decent, short enough to be honest. I explained the name change, the new position, the move to Portland. I said I needed some distance to think clearly about our relationships. I said I hoped we could have real conversations someday. My mother responded in 3 days. She said Portland was far. She said Dana was going through a difficult quarter at work and could really use my support. She said she hoped I wasn't doing this because of the graduation, because they had watched the live stream and it looked like a wonderful ceremony. My father's response was a single line. "You're making a big deal out of nothing as usual." Dana didn't respond at all. I packed 4 boxes and a carload of books and drove north. Portland suited me in the unglamorous, functional way that the right environments do. The Meridian Institute was a converted warehouse near the waterfront, staffed by people who got visibly excited about contamination modeling and regulatory gap analysis. Dr. Crane handed me a project intake file on my first day and said, "We think there's something wrong in the mid-tier cold chain infrastructure. We just can't prove it yet." "That's your job." I found it inside 7 months. Not a dramatic discovery, science rarely is. It was a pattern in voluntary recall data cross-referenced with outbreak reports and third-party auditing timestamps. A specific category of regional food distributors, mid-size companies operating between the large national chains and small local suppliers, had reporting structures that created a consistent 18 to 22-day blind spot between internal flagging of possible contamination, chin to the FDA. That window was long enough for affected product to move through multiple retail channels and reach consumers. One of the distributors in our flag dataset was a company called Voss Family Foods. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. My father had quietly incorporated a food distribution subsidiary 4 years earlier, extending the family's consumer goods business into regional grocery supply. I knew about it only peripherally. Dana had mentioned it once as an example of Dad's entrepreneurial instincts. I had not known until I ran the company name through our dataset that Voss Family Foods was one of 11 regional distributors our model had identified as operating within the high-risk structural window. I had not known they had received 2 informal FDA inquiries in the previous 18 months that had not resulted in formal action. My conflict of interest disclosure to Dr. Crane took about 12 minutes. She listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, and said, "You're recused from the policy recommendation section. Everything else, you continue." And Margot, thank you for telling me immediately. That night, I called my father. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. We had not spoken in 4 months. I told him as clearly and factually as I could what our research had found. I told him the FDA was likely to receive our full report within 60 days. I told him the pattern we had identified in his company's reporting structure created legal exposure. I told him the responsible action was to conduct an internal audit, self-report to the FDA proactively. There was a long silence. "Then you're doing this because of the graduation." "I'm doing this," I said, "because it's my job and because people could get sick." "People aren't sick, not yet. That's the point of prevention." My mother got on the line. I heard the transfer, the familiar sound of the handset being passed. "Margot. Honey. You have to understand what this would do to the business. Your father has worked 30 years to build something real. You want to hand that to regulators over a computer model." I thought about the woman in the procession line who had cheered for me. I thought about my grandmother's handwritten note. I thought about the 18 to 22-day window and what could move through a supply chain in that time. "I want you to fix it before they find it," I said. "That's still an option. But it won't be an option much longer." My father came back on the line. We didn't come to your ceremony and now you want to destroy what we built. That's what this is. You skipped my doctorate for a dinner reservation, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised me. I'm trying to prevent a public health event. Those are not the same story. He hung up. I contacted a public interest attorney who specialized in research whistleblower protections the next morning. I documented everything: my disclosure to Dr. Crane, the timeline of my recusal, every communication with my family. The FDA received our full report 61 days later. 3 other researchers were listed as primary authors. I was listed as a contributing analyst with a disclosed conflict of interest. The investigation moved with the particular quiet efficiency of federal agencies when the evidence is organized and the paper trail is clean. Within 4 months, Voss Family Foods had received a formal warning letter, a mandatory corrective action plan, and a civil penalty that my attorney explained, matter-of-factly, would likely result in a whistleblower protection payout once the process concluded. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be precise about that, because the triumphant version of the story would be easier to tell and also untrue. What I felt was a heavy, specific relief, the kind that comes not from winning but from the exhausting work of being consistent. I had done my job. I had told my family what was coming. I had documented my own complicated position honestly. The outcome was not something I had engineered. It was something I had simply refused to prevent. My mother sent a letter. Real paper, careful handwriting. It said they had lost 2 major retail accounts. It said my father was meeting with attorneys every week. It said Dana was very upset and felt I had betrayed the family. Near the end, in smaller letters than the rest, it said, "I think about your graduation sometimes. I don't know if we understood what it meant to you." I read that sentence many times. I noticed what it was and what it was not. It was an acknowledgement. It was not an apology. It was the closest thing to honesty my mother had offered me in years, and it arrived only after consequence had made honesty affordable. I wrote back. I said I was sorry for the difficulty they were facing. I said I had tried to give them the chance to avoid it. I said I was open to honest conversations, not performances of resolution. I signed it with my name, my full legal chosen name, and I meant both parts of it equally. The whistleblower payout, when it arrived, was significant enough that I blinked at the number for a long time before accepting it was addressed to me. I put a portion of it toward a down payment on a small house in Portland with a garden I don't entirely know how to tend yet. I put another portion into a research fund at the Meridian Institute for graduate students from rural, low-income backgrounds studying food systems, the students who would have been me 20 years ago, working a tutoring center shift after receiving scholarship news that nobody celebrated. I have not spoken to my father. My mother and I exchange brief, careful emails every few months. Dana sent a message last winter that said only, "I hope you're well." I replied that I was. Both of those things were true. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 31, standing in a parking garage in the cold, playing a voicemail for the 4th time. Some people will only ever understand the value of what you do when the absence of it costs them something. That is not a tragedy. It is information. And information in the right hands is not a weapon. It is just clarity. I tend the garden badly. The house is quiet in the mornings. I make coffee and watch the fog come off the hills and think, this is what I was trying to get to, all those years of being the second story in someone else's house. So I'll leave you with this. If the people in your life have confused your reliability with their entitlement, your competence with their convenience, at what point does staying loyal to them become disloyal to yourself? And when you finally answer that question honestly, what do you think you'll do with the answer? The word landed at a dinner table. Not in a scream but in a calm, practiced voice, the kind designed to end conversations before they become inconvenient. My stepsister looked directly at me, arms loosely folded, expression composed, and said I was toxic. That she wanted me gone. So I left. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't outline everything she'd overlooked for the past 3 years. I picked up my jacket, said nothing, and walked to my car. The drive home took 11 minutes. I timed it without meaning to, a habit from years of working with precision. 7 days later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her first voicemail lasted 40 seconds. Her second one, 7 seconds. Just her breathing and a clipped, sharp call me back. By the time I listened to them all in sequence, I could chart the exact moment panic replaced entitlement. My name is Renata. I'm 37, and I work in healthcare compliance, reviewing documentation systems, auditing billing accuracy, catching the gaps that cost hospitals money or patients dignity. It requires a specific kind of patience, the ability to sit with uncomfortable information and not react until you understand the full shape of it. I didn't realize until recently how much that skill had been governing my personal life too. My father died when I was 9. My mother remarried within 4 years. He was steady enough, my stepfather, not unkind. Exactly, but occupying space in the way furniture does. His daughter, Priya, was 2 years younger than me, and arrived in our household already knowing how to read a room for advantage. I don't say that bitterly. It's simply what I observed, the way I'd observe anything. I was the one who didn't cause friction. I did well in school, built my credentials, kept my finances clean and separate. Independence wasn't something I chose so much as something I arrived at because no one was fighting me for it. I assumed that was enough to maintain equilibrium. Then my grandmother died, and everything rearranged itself. She left me her apartment, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood that had gotten quieter and nicer over the decades. It wasn't large, but it was solid. It smelled like cedar and afternoon light. She'd told me once that a space should hold you without demanding anything in return. When she signed it over to me in her will, I understood it as exactly that, a gift of stability, something tethered to no one's expectations but mine. For about 6 months I held it. Then Priya's finances collapsed. A relationship that had been her primary support evaporated. A freelance business she'd started never found traction. And somehow my mother's solution materialized as a single sentence. The apartment's just sitting there. I said yes. I told myself it was temporary. I believed it. That was 3 years before the dinner. In the beginning, it looked like generosity between people who understood the stakes. She moved in. I covered utilities as a buffer while she stabilized. But stabilization has a way of becoming a lifestyle when no one enforces a transition. Months became a year. A year became 2. The conversations about timelines got vaguer, then disappeared. My name appeared on repair requests without being asked first. Small costs routed themselves back to me through my mother, framed as temporary, always temporary. I noticed the shift in language before I named what it meant. Priya stopped using words like if or eventually. She used we when discussing the apartment as though we shared ownership. At family dinners, my financial stability was referenced the way people reference good weather, as a given condition, not an earned outcome. Then the engagement happened. I won't say the wedding planning was the breaking point because that framing gives it too much importance. It was more like the moment a shape I'd been half seeing for years finally resolved into something I couldn't pretend was blurry. The costs floated into our conversations casually, attached to nothing, until I realized they were attached to me. My mother smoothed things over. She's just excited. You know how weddings are. You're in a position to help. The dinner was my mother's idea. A family gathering, no agenda, just a meal. When I arrived, Priya's future in-laws were seated at the table, and the energy in the room had the particular density of a prepared presentation. She outlined the wedding, not as a request but as a plan that had already been decided. Venue, aesthetic, numbers. When she turned to me, her expression held the same expectation I'd been trained to meet for 3 years. I said I was glad to contribute, but that I couldn't be responsible for the whole thing. I said I had limits. Someone across the table made a remark about what must be easy for a woman in my position. My stepfather mentioned family loyalty. My mother's face went carefully neutral. And then Priya, with a calm that mirrored my own, called me toxic. Said it like a verdict. Said it like the conversation was over. I looked around the table. No one disagreed. I picked up my jacket and left. I didn't sleep that night, but not from hurt, more from the clarity that comes when you finally stop arguing with what you've known for a long time. My brain ran through every version of that dinner, every smoothed-over conversation, every cost that had migrated silently into my column. Not in anger. In accounting. The following morning I started writing things down, not a grievance list, just an honest inventory. What I'd been subsidizing, for how long, and what amounts. I hadn't done it before because doing it would have required me to stop calling it generosity. I called Marcus 4 days later. He's an attorney I'd crossed paths with, through work, calm, precise, no interest in drama. We sat across from each other in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I explained the situation the same way I'd explain a compliance issue. He nodded through most of it. There was nothing complicated about the legal reality. The apartment was mine. No lease, no formal arrangement, just an informal agreement that had been allowed to persist. He walked me through the steps, a formal notice, a timeline, nothing aggressive, nothing punitive. Process. I left his office and sat in my car for a long time. I kept thinking about my grandmother's face, the way she had a particular look when she thought someone was settling for less than they were worth. I don't know if she could have anticipated this specific situation, but I know she wouldn't have been surprised by it. That evening I followed the process Marcus had outlined. A notice was drafted, reviewed, signed. I dropped it at the post office near my apartment without ceremony. It felt exactly as mundane as mailing a utility payment. On the drive home, I noticed the tension I'd been carrying between my shoulder blades had shifted, not gone, but changed in quality. Less like resistance, more like resolution. 3 days later, the calls started. I was reheating dinner when my phone lit up. I let it go to voicemail. Then again. By the time I answered, she'd called 7 times in 20 minutes. Her voice had lost all of its dinner table composure. Why did I get an eviction notice? She didn't say hello. The panic in her question was raw in a way her confidence never had been. I could hear voices in the background, my mother, I thought, maybe my stepfather. All of them suddenly very present, very invested. I leaned against my kitchen counter and let a second pass before answering. The arrangement was always temporary, I said. I gave formal notice. She said it had to be a mistake. She said my mother had told her I'd calm down, that I was being emotional. That word again. I noticed it the same way I notice a discrepancy in a billing document. There's no mistake, I said. My voice was even. The timeline is in the notice. The calls didn't stop. They came in cycles, confusion giving way to anger, giving way to bargaining. My mother called 2 days later, her voice held carefully steady. She said we were family and could talk through this. I asked her one question. Was I family at that dinner? She didn't answer. I told her I'd honored the timeline in the notice and that was the extent of what I owed at this point. They came to my door 4 days after that, all 3 of them. I looked through the peephole before opening it. Priya stood closest, arms folded, jaw set. My mother stood slightly behind her. My stepfather stood at the edge like a man who understood he was present but couldn't decide whether to be invested. I opened the door but didn't invite anyone in. Priya said I had embarrassed the family. Said I had done it out of spite. You asked me to leave, I said. I left. I didn't realize that came with conditions. That's not the same thing and you know it, she said. You were comfortable, I replied. There's a real difference. My mother said Priya hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that people say things in moments of frustration, that I shouldn't let one word define everything. I nodded. And the consequences of words are real regardless of the intention behind them. My stepfather cleared his throat. You don't actually need the income, he said. You're doing well. Why make this harder than it needs to be? That sentence did something the others hadn't. It finally said plainly what had always been implied. That my needs were negotiable because my situation was stable. That my ownership was conditional on my convenience to others. I looked at him and felt something in me become completely still. This isn't about need, I said. It's about what belongs to me and whether I get to decide what happens with it. Priya's expression shifted. Then, as though she'd retrieved it from storage, she said it again. You're being toxic. I didn't flinch. Toxic people, I said quietly. Don't let family live rent-free for 3 years in apartments they inherited. No one spoke for a moment. My mother's expression moved through several things quickly. My stepfather looked at the floor. Where are we supposed to go? Priya asked. Her voice had dropped. The certainty had left it entirely. That, I said, is the question you should have been asking 3 years ago. She tried several approaches after that, apology, then accusation, then apology again, each one sounding like the previous draft of a message she kept revising. I told her the timeline in the notice would be honored and that nothing else needed to be negotiated. They left without an incident, which is the most accurate description I have. The final day, I stayed in my car across the street. I watched them load boxes. Priya put the key on my hood without looking at me, her hand resting there a second longer than necessary. They drove away. I didn't feel righteous. I felt the particular relief of a weight that's been so familiar it stopped registering as weight, until it was gone. I had the apartment repainted and repaired within 2 weeks. New tenants moved in the following month, found through a property manager, vetted properly, paying a fair rate. The first rent payment arrived on a Tuesday morning. Unremarkable, predictable, clean. My family has not reached out since. I've spent a certain amount of time with that silence, examining it, testing whether it feels like loss. It does, but not in the way I expected. What I lost wasn't the relationship. It was the version of the relationship I'd been maintaining through continuous compromise. The actual relationship, the one that existed when I stopped paying for access to it, turned out to be considerably smaller. There's a word people reach for when someone stops performing convenience. It tends to sound like a moral assessment. But a word used to stop a conversation isn't an argument, it's a signal that the person using it has run out of leverage. What I learned is that the moment you stop being useful to someone who has only ever needed your usefulness, they will name you the problem as though that changes the arithmetic. It doesn't. Have you ever realized too late that you'd been auditing everything around you clearly but kept refusing to look at your own column? And when you finally did, what did the numbers say? The morning I finally stopped carrying them, I made coffee first. That detail matters. I didn't lunge for my phone. I didn't rehearse the conversation I should have had years ago. I filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and stood in my narrow galley kitchen listening to the water begin its slow climb to boiling. Only when the cup was in my hands, still too hot to drink properly, did I open the laptop and pull up the file I'd named Insurance Docs, a name chosen precisely because no one in my family would ever click on it. The spreadsheet was 14 rows long. 4 years of monthly transfers, each one logged with a date, an amount and a note field I'd filled in with the kind of neutral language an accountant would use. Household contribution. Recurring support. Living expense subsidy. I had refused, even in a private file no one would ever see, to call it what it was. I scrolled to the bottom. The sum cell read $223,200. I sat with that number for a long time. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm a licensed healthcare compliance auditor, the kind of professional hospitals and medical groups hire when their billing practices are being reviewed by federal regulators. My work is by nature about finding what doesn't match. The procedure coded one way, billed another, the authorization that exists in one system and vanishes in the next. I am paid at a fairly good rate to notice discrepancies. I can spot a documentation gap from 50 feet. What I could not seem to do for 4 years running was apply that same clinical attention to my own life. My mother, Renata, had a gift for framing. She was the kind of woman who could say something cutting and have it land as a compliment before the sentence finished. My sister Brooke, 18 months younger, professionally a brand wellness strategist, which meant she consulted for boutique fitness companies on their Instagram aesthetic, was her masterwork. Brooke had vision, our mother said, often. Brooke understood people. Brooke had an instinct for beauty that couldn't be taught. I apparently was good with the details. The dinner at which all of this collapsed had begun the way those dinners usually did. My father, Warren, grilling salmon on the terrace of the downtown apartment, while Brooke narrated her latest project, and my mother nodded with an expression that implied she had personally brought Brooke's talent into the world and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. I had driven 40 minutes in traffic. I had brought wine. It was somewhere between the main course and what would never become dessert that my mother made her observation. Dana handles the practical side of things. Brooke is the one with the larger picture. She smiled when she said it. The smile was the part that got me. I set down my fork. The larger picture, I said, currently costs $4,600 a month. I would love for Brooke's vision to cover it. The table went quiet in a specific way, the way it goes quiet when someone has said a true thing in a room built entirely on the agreement not to. My father looked at me as if I'd switched languages mid-sentence. Cover what? He said. We own this place. No, I said. You don't. I had looked into it 2 months earlier. The condo my parents had moved into after selling the suburban house was rented, not purchased. The proceeds of the sale had gone somewhere else, a fact my father genuinely did not know. He had trusted my mother with the financial transition completely. My mother had trusted Brooke's business venture, a wellness subscription box that had dissolved after 11 months, taking most of the capital with it. What remained was a rental that my father believed was an asset. What remained of his retirement was largely theoretical. I had known this for 8 weeks. I had kept making the transfers. I pushed back my chair. The sound of it across the hardwood was sharp and final, like a door with a good seal. I said goodbye. My mother started to speak. I was already walking. By the time I reached my car, my hands were steady. That was the thing I hadn't expected, not the steadiness itself, but how unsurprised I was by it. Somewhere in the 4 years of monthly transfers and dinners where I was described as reliable, predictable, the one who handled things, I had quietly made my decision. Tonight was just the moment I let it become audible. My phone started filling up before I'd cleared the parking structure. Brooke left 3 voice messages, each one in a higher register than the last. The framing shifted with each recording. First I was jealous, then I was cruel. Then I was destabilizing the family at a really vulnerable time, a phrase that might have landed differently if I hadn't spent the prior 2 years being the reason the family was not, technically, already destabilized. My mother's texts had the quality of someone who had convinced herself a clerical error was responsible. Transfer issue. Please call immediately. Dana, the bank flagged something. Call us. She could not write the actual words. She could not type you stopped. To her, that wasn't a possible sequence of events. The practical daughter paid the bills. That was the natural order. I didn't respond that night. I opened a different application and began drafting a formal non-renewal notice, the kind I had seen in a dozen compliance contexts, precise, statutory, stripped of anything that could be read as emotion. I cited the relevant notice period. I indicated the date by which the space would need to be vacated. I printed it, addressed it to my father, because my mother would have handed it to Brooke and mailed it the next morning on my way to work. What came 10 days later was my father, standing in my office doorway with a manila folder he clearly believed contained evidence of something. He had found or been given a document he thought was a property deed. He put it on my desk. I looked at it for about 4 seconds. This is a screenshot, I said. The county recorder's watermark is a JPEG artifact. The parcel number doesn't match the building's address. I turned my monitor so he could see the actual registry search I'd already run. The transaction history on the sale proceeds was there, if you knew where to look, which he hadn't, and which I did. I watched his face work through several things at once. He had spent years believing the story his wife and younger daughter had been telling. He had believed it because it was easier, because it was the one on offer, because the alternative, that the money was gone, that his retirement had funded a subscription box for artisanal wellness products, was not a story a person volunteers to inhabit. The $4,800 I've been paying every month, I said, and kept my voice level. I thought I was protecting you. I was actually just delaying it. He didn't answer. We sat in the silence of that for a moment. 60 days later, I stood in the apartment one final time for the walkthrough. Brooke cycled through several modes: apology, grievance, appeal, with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that emotion was a tool. My mother stood very still, which was how she looked when she had decided the appropriate response was to wait for circumstances to correct themselves. My father looked out the window at the city he had wanted to live in, and had not, it turned out, been able to afford. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. I said goodbye clearly and I closed the door. 3 weeks later, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom unit in a building I had selected myself, evaluated the financials on, and could afford without restructuring anything else in my life. It was on the 4th floor. In the mornings, the light came in at an angle that made the whole room feel different from the studios and sublets I'd been rotating through for 4 years while paying for someone else's view. I sat at the kitchen table that first morning with coffee and my laptop, the insurance docs folder open and renamed at last. I had retitled it Baseline, not as a sentiment, as an accounting term. The point from which forward movement is measured. Here is what I understand now. On the other side of it, there is a particular kind of invisible labor that looks from the outside like reliability. The person doing it often believes they are holding something fragile together. Sometimes what they are actually doing is holding something false in place, keeping the pressure low enough that no one has to look at the structure underneath. It is not love, though it can feel like it. It is maintenance of a fiction, usually at significant personal cost. If someone in your life has named you the capable one, the practical one, the one who handles things, it may be worth asking what exactly it is you are handling, and whether the building you are supporting was ever really meant to stand. The fluorescent light above the hospital bed made everything look slightly wrong, too bright, too clinical, too indifferent to what had just happened. Nora was sitting on the edge of a plastic chair when her mother reached across and touched her forearm, a gesture meant to soften things, to suggest that what had been done was somehow survivable in a family sense. Nora moved her arm away without a word. She watched her mother's expression shift, and did not feel sorry. Maisie had been missing for 5 hours. The patrol officer had been careful with his language when he explained the situation, the way people are careful when they have terrible news and no idea how to carry it. A long-haul driver, heading south on Route 9, had spotted a child at the shoulder of the road near the junction with Old Caldwell Lane at 10:12 in the evening. The child was 6 years old, wearing a thin jacket, her sneakers gray with road dust, asking anyone who would listen for her mother by name. The officer said Maisie had been lucky. Nora remembered thinking that luck had nothing to do with it. Her sister Claudia had done this. Claudia had made a choice, and luck was not a relevant variable. The favor, as Claudia would later call it, had begun at afternoon pickup. Nora's car was in the shop. Her husband Darnell was in Phoenix for a conference. She had asked Claudia because Claudia was available, and because Nora had not yet fully absorbed the lesson that availability was not the same thing as reliability. Claudia had picked Maisie up at 3:20, which Nora knew only from the school's sign-out log, one of several documents she would later collect with the methodical focus of someone building a case, which of course she was. The story came out in pieces from Maisie first, in the fragmented syntax of a child trying to report something her vocabulary wasn't built for, and then later from Claudia herself. There had been a spill. A juice box, crimson and sticky, had rolled off the back seat and soaked into the upholstery of Claudia's car, a gray sedan, Claudia treated with the reverence some people reserve for living things. Claudia had been running late to meet someone, a man she had described to Nora twice before in terms that suggested she considered this particular relationship an event of civic importance. The spill had made her angry. The anger had made her irrational. And so she had pulled onto the gravel shoulder at the Old Caldwell Junction, explained to Maisie in what Maisie later described as her disappointed voice that Maisie would need to wait there while Claudia handled something and driven away. Maisie had waited 2 hours and 40 minutes. She had called out for a while. Then she had stopped because her throat hurt. Then she had sat down on a concrete mile marker and done something Nora had drilled into her since she was 4. She had remembered the phone number. When the driver found her, she recited it like a prayer. Nora held her daughter for a long time in that hospital room. She catalogued the weight of her, the specific exhaustion in her small body, the way Maisie's fingers knotted into Nora's shirt and refused to release. The pediatrician said she was physically fine. Then the pediatrician said, in the careful register clinicians use for things they cannot actually fix, that there might be some emotional processing ahead. Nora nodded. She already knew. She had watched Maisie flinch when a car door closed in the parking garage. She had heard her ask, 3 times in 2 hours, whether Nora was going to leave. Claudia arrived at Nora's house just past midnight. She still had her going-out clothes on. Her lipstick was slightly uneven. She stood in the doorway of Maisie's room where Nora was sitting in the dark and said, without any particular introduction, that Maisie was safe, that the road was well-traveled, that kids were adaptable. Then she said she had done the family a favor by not letting a child's tantrum derail an entire evening. Nora did not respond. She had learned early in life that Claudia required an audience and that removing the audience was the most precise tool available. The silence seemed to confuse Claudia, who filled it by expanding on her position, that Nora was overreacting, that children needed to learn that actions carried consequences, that this whole situation was being blown entirely out of proportion. Their father appeared behind Claudia in the doorway. He was still in his work clothes. He looked at Maisie sleeping, and at Nora sitting beside her, and said that both he and their mother understood why Claudia had made the decision she did. His voice was steady. That steadiness cost Nora something she didn't have a word for. She spent the next 4 days building documentation. Hospital records. The police report. Photographs of Maisie's feet blistered along the heels from walking on gravel in thin-soled sneakers. Notes from the pediatrician. Her own journal entries, time-stamped, recording Maisie's nightmares, her new resistance to getting into cars, the way she stood very close to Nora in any room, never more than an arm's length away. She documented her parents' responses as well. Her mother's suggestion that Maisie had probably lost track of time. Her father's position that children benefit from learning to manage unexpected situations. Claudia's escalating certainty that she had done nothing wrong. She retained a family law attorney. Not to file suit, not immediately, but to establish legal standing for what came next. The attorney reviewed the documentation and did not seem surprised by any of it. The temporary restraining order was filed within the week. It prohibited Claudia from being alone with Maisie, from transporting her anywhere, from coming within a defined distance of her without Nora's explicit written consent. The judge reviewed the file thoroughly. He granted it without objection. There was something in his expression when he looked up that Nora recognized as the face of someone who had seen this kind of damage before. Then she called the state's child welfare hotline and made a report not only on Claudia, but on her parents, who had responded to their granddaughter's abandonment by defending the person responsible for it. She was not confused about what she was doing. She understood that this would be treated as a betrayal by every member of her family. She also understood that protecting Maisie from further harm required not just addressing Claudia, but addressing the environment that had told Claudia her behavior was acceptable. Her phone began ringing 90 minutes later. Her mother's voice was high and slightly unsteady, asking what Nora had done as though the answer required explanation. The investigation moved quickly. Her father's small contracting business, which ran almost entirely on community referrals, began losing clients within the month. People who had recommended him for decades quietly stopped. The CPS record, though it resulted in no charges, her parents had never directly harmed a child, became part of the public record. In a town the size of theirs, that was sufficient. Her mother, who had anchored her social life to her role as the generous stabilizing center of a large family network, found invitations thinning. The women she had known for 20 years became suddenly busy. Claudia's freelance event coordination work, which had depended entirely on word of mouth and the perception that she was a person of sound judgment, contracted sharply. A major client association declined to renew after learning of the investigation. Others followed. Nora had also spoken on the record, with a reporter writing a piece on child safety and family accountability. She had not named anyone. She had not needed to. The piece ran for several days. Everyone who knew Claudia understood exactly who had left a child on the side of Route 9. Have you ever done something you knew was right and felt no relief from it? That was the precise texture of this. There was no warmth in watching her mother become someone people stepped around at the farmer's market. There was no release in knowing that Claudia had ultimately moved to another state, in part because remaining in the same town had become untenable. Nora had not wanted any of that. What she had wanted was simpler and more fundamental. She had wanted her daughter to be safe and to know that someone had made the cost of that danger real and permanent. The restraining order became permanent when Claudia's attorney, having reviewed the full evidentiary record, advised her to accept the terms rather than contest them in front of a judge. That advice was sound. Nora knew it was sound because she had assembled everything carefully. She worked in healthcare compliance, had done so for 11 years, and the architecture of documentation. Maisie's nightmares stopped after 4 months. By spring, she was entering cars without pausing at the door. By summer, she had stopped shadowing Nora through the house. What she did not stop doing was making sure, every time they went somewhere, that she knew the plan and that the plan included coming home together. Nora considered this a reasonable adjustment for a child to make. A letter arrived from out of state about 1.5 years later. Claudia's handwriting. Inside, she wrote that she was in therapy, that she had spent a significant amount of time trying to understand how she had reduced a child she claimed to love into an inconvenience she felt she could leave at the side of a road. She wrote that she did not expect forgiveness and was not asking for it as a transaction. She wrote that she was trying to become someone who would not do such a thing again. Nora read it carefully. Then she placed it in a folder alongside the hospital discharge papers and the police report, and she moved forward. Her parents never apologized. Her mother, in a letter sent the following winter that also went unanswered, wrote that she had only been trying to hold the family together. Nora thought about that framing for a long time. The family that had needed holding was the one composed of Nora and Maisie and Darnell. That family was intact. That family was fine. When Maisie was 8, she asked why Aunt Claudia didn't come around anymore, why Grandma and Grandpa lived somewhere else now. Nora told her the truth in terms a child could hold, that Nora had protected her because Maisie mattered, that there were things people did that had real consequences, and that Nora would always choose her. Always, without exception, without negotiation. By the time Maisie was 10, she had absorbed something that Nora hoped would last her whole life, that the people who genuinely loved you were the ones who refused to treat your safety as a variable. Most people, when they imagine this kind of story, expect some version of resolution that restores what was broken. A reconciliation, a softening, a return to something resembling before. What I learned is that the restoration I was responsible for was not the family I'd grown up in, but the one I was building. And that distinction, quiet as it was, changed everything. If the people around you treated a child's safety as negotiable, what would you be willing to lose to make clear that it wasn't? The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway hummed at a frequency I had trained myself to ignore. I had spent enough time in public buildings to know that certain sounds, certain particular silences, either unmade you or they didn't. I straightened the lanyard on my badge out of habit, even though I wasn't wearing one, pressed my folder against my side, and walked through the double doors into courtroom 4B of the Fulton County Superior Court in Atlanta. She was already seated. 3rd row, left side, wearing a charcoal blazer with a cream blouse. My biological mother. I recognized her the way you recognize a landscape from an old photograph. The proportions were right, but nothing felt the way you expected it to feel. She was 61 now. She did not look at me. She was watching the plaintiff's table with the focused, acquisitive attention I remembered from childhood, the way she looked at things she had decided she was owed. I had not spoken to her in 19 years. I had not been afraid of her in 17. Those are 2 different milestones, and they matter in different ways. Let me explain how we arrived in the same room. I was 9 years old when my parents left me at the Atlanta Greyhound Terminal on a gray Wednesday in November. My father said he needed to check the departure board. My mother gave me a bag of crackers, pointed to a row of blue plastic chairs near the west wall, and told me to sit there and not move. She said they would be back in 10 minutes. She said this with the same flat assurance she used when she told me to make my bed or finish my vegetables. Not unkind, not warm, simply factual. I sat down. I ate the crackers in approximately 8 minutes, because I was anxious, and I did not know yet that I was anxious. I watched the entrance doors for the next 4 hours. A depot employee named Beverly finally noticed me. She had a thermos clipped to her bag and a name tag with a small American flag sticker on it. She asked me where my people were. I told her they were checking the board. She looked at the board, which was 40 feet away and visible from where we were both standing, and then she looked back at me. She nodded the way adults nod when they are trying to keep their faces from showing you the thing their face is already showing you. She said she was going to make a call and offered me a bottle of water. Police came. Then a caseworker. Then more waiting in a room with plastic chairs and a television bolted too high on the wall. I kept constructing explanations. I was 9. It was the only architecture available to me. What I didn't learn until I was 27, standing in a records office in Fulton County with a legal pad and a very specific reason for being there. They described me as emotionally volatile. They said I had a history of running away. I had never run away from anything. I was in 4th grade. The most defiant thing I had ever done was hide a library book under my mattress because I wasn't finished with it. They had, I would further learn, taken out an insurance policy on me 20 months before that Wednesday. It paid a lump sum upon a qualifying disappearance exceeding 18 months. They collected $80,000 when I was 11. I didn't know that part yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. His name was Gerald Okafor. He was 56 years old, a recently retired hospital administrator with a precise, unhurried manner and the habit of carrying things in his jacket pockets that seemed impractical. He came to the family services waiting area on a Tuesday because he had agreed to mentor a teenager in the transitional housing unit down the hall and arrived to find the meeting had been rescheduled. He was about to leave. Instead, he sat down in the chair next to mine and asked if I knew how to play dominoes. I told him I didn't. He said that was easily fixed and produced a small travel set from his left pocket. He was patient without performing patience. He explained the rules twice without any indication that he found my forgetting inconvenient. When the caseworker came to move me to a temporary placement, he stood and shook my hand with full seriousness and told me I had a good eye for patterns. I assumed I would never see him again. He returned 6 days later with a library card he had requested on my behalf, and a paperback novel about a girl who uncovers the truth about her grandmother's past. He had gone through official channels, filled out the correct forms, introduced himself to my caseworker with documentation. He visited every week for 11 months. Through 3 placements. Through a stretch of several weeks when I stopped talking much at all because I had run out of language for what I was carrying and didn't know how to explain that. He never pushed. He brought the dominoes. Once he brought a small cellophane bag of sour cherry candies that I hadn't tasted since a birthday party in 1st grade, which I hadn't told him about. I don't know how he knew. When I was 10, he asked, formally, if I would be open to him applying as a foster parent. He said he wanted me to know I had a real choice. He said trust had to be built and he hadn't finished building it yet, if I was honest, and he knew it. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I moved into his house on a Saturday in March. A brick 2-story in Decatur, spare and organized, with plants on every windowsill and medical textbooks stacked on the kitchen counter next to cookbooks. It smelled like coffee and dish soap and something green. He showed me my room. There was a yellow quilt and a lamp with a white shade on, which someone, Gerald, had drawn small constellations in permanent marker. He said I could change anything I wanted. He meant it. I kept the quilt. I kept the lamp. I have them both. What Gerald never mentioned in all the years we shared that house and all the years after was that he had money. Not a comfortable salary, not careful savings. Actual, substantial generational money that had come from his father and been multiplied by Gerald's particular combination of institutional knowledge and extreme disinterest in spending it. He drove a 10-year-old Civic. He bought reduced for quick sale produce. He repaired things himself. I knew he wasn't struggling, but I understood him as a careful man. He never corrected that understanding. He said once, when I asked why he didn't update the kitchen, that the kitchen worked. That was the full extent of his commentary on the subject. He paid for my undergraduate degree without describing it as exceptional. He paid for my master's in healthcare compliance without describing it as anything at all. When I finished my licensure exams and went to work as a compliance officer for a regional hospital network, he took me to dinner and ordered good wine and told me he was proud of me. Just that. I had to look at the window for a moment. He pretended not to notice. He was good at that. I was 33 when Gerald called to say he wanted to talk in person. He was 77. He had been slowing down in small, dignified ways for 2 years, and I had been watching it and not watching it simultaneously. We sat at his kitchen table the way we had sat at it hundreds of times. He told me about the money the way he told me everything. Matter of fact, no performance, information being transferred because the time had come for it. He had updated his will. He wanted me to hear the specifics from him, not from an executor after the fact. The estate was valued at $4.2 million. I sat still for a long moment. I said his name. He said he knew. I said it was everything he'd built. He said he knew what it was, and he knew who should have it. There was nothing to argue with in that sentence. Gerald had never said anything he didn't mean. He died the following spring, a quiet Tuesday morning at home. I took 3 weeks off work. I packed his house slowly, and with care. I kept the domino set. I kept the mug he used every morning, which had a small chip on the handle that he had never bothered to replace because it still worked. I donated his clothes. I cried more than I expected and also exactly as much as I needed to, which turned out to be the same thing. 8 weeks after the estate was filed, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing my biological parents. They were suing for the full estate. The legal theory, such as it was, argued that as my biological next of kin they held a prior claim to any inheritance I received, and that Gerald's estate should transfer to them as my family of record. They made this argument despite the fact that a family court had terminated their parental rights when I was 11. They made it despite the fact that Gerald had legally adopted me when I was 13. The return address was an apartment in Marietta, Georgia, 22 minutes from where they had left me at that terminal. I read the letter twice. I set it down. I was not trembling. I was not overwhelmed. I was thinking with the particular focused clarity that Gerald had helped me build over 24 years. I called my colleague Delia, who runs the estate and litigation practice at the firm where I consult. She came over that evening, read the filing, and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She said they had no standing. I said I was aware. She said whoever drafted this either didn't understand basic estate law or assumed I didn't. I told her that assuming I didn't understand things was something of a family tradition. She said she would represent me. I said I wanted to handle the courtroom myself. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said fine, but she would be at my table during every preparation session, and I was not doing this alone. I agreed. I filed the response. We counterclaimed for legal fees and frivolous litigation. And then I did one additional thing because I had spent 6 years in healthcare compliance and I knew precisely how to follow a paper trail. I hired an investigator. She returned her findings in 9 days. The missing child report with its fabricated behavioral history. The insurance policy, executed 20 months before the terminal. The payout, $80,000 claimed when I was 11 under a prolonged disappearance clause. Both signatures. The notary. Insurance fraud, first filed in 1996 and never investigated because nobody had connected the policy to a deliberate act. Because my parents had been careful. Because I had been a child with no knowledge of what had actually happened. I forwarded everything to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. Then I went back to work. The hearing was assigned to Judge Carol Ashburn, who had the manner of someone who has encountered every variation of human reasoning under pressure and has retained, despite this, a genuine interest in how people talk themselves into things. She looked at the plaintiff's filing. She looked at our response. She asked their attorney to walk her through the basis for standing. What followed was 14 minutes of the most uncomfortable legal improvisation I had witnessed in a courtroom. When he finished, she turned to me. I stood. I had prepared for 10 days. I spoke for 8 minutes. I laid out the adoption record, the termination decree, the statutory framework that left their claim not merely weak but structurally non-existent. I was calm. Gerald had taught me over decades of kitchen table conversation that precision was its own form of respect, that saying exactly what you meant saved everyone, including yourself, a great deal of unnecessary suffering. The judge ruled from the bench. The case was dismissed. Full legal fees were awarded. She used the phrase without legal merit and then used it again in a different construction, which was not standard practice, which meant she wanted it in the record twice. As my mother stood to leave, she looked at me directly for the first time since I had walked through those doors. I don't know what she was looking for. Some signal that she had still reached me, even losing. I looked back at her. I gave her nothing. Not because I was still wounded. I had done that work, years of it in a therapist's office on Tuesday evenings. But because there was nothing left of me that belonged to her. She had made a decision about that the afternoon she handed me a bag of crackers and pointed to a row of blue chairs. 3 weeks later, the DA's office filed charges. Insurance fraud, filing a false report, fraudulent misrepresentation. Dalia texted me one line. "It's moving." I sat at my desk for a minute. Then I finished the report I was writing. In the fall of that year, I established the Gerald Okafor Fund, which provides healthcare advocacy and legal support to children in foster placement navigating institutional systems alone. I funded it with a portion of the estate. I still take cases myself when I can. I sit across the table from children who have learned to make themselves small and quiet, and I say, which is what I mean, and nothing more. The domino set sits on my desk. Gerald always left it mid-game. "A problem to return to," he said, "when you had enough patience to see it clearly." I have thought about patience a great deal over the years, what it costs, what it returns, the difference between waiting and enduring. Gerald spent 11 months visiting a silent child in other people's houses before he asked for anything. My parents made their decision before I finished a bag of crackers. Those two facts are the entire shape of my life. Have you ever found yourself holding space for someone who had already decided to leave, still defending them, still waiting at a door they locked on their way out? I'd like to know how long it took you to stop. And what you did with the room once you finally let yourself use it.